Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Nuevo Paraiso Wash Process Mexico from Hex Coffee Roasters. And there's the box right there. And Hex, based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. And they're a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel multiple times before. However, it has been over a year since we've last reviewed one of their coffees. So when I did see them at a local coffee shop, I was definitely interested in trying something, given that I'd had pretty positive experiences with them in the past. One thing I did notice when looking through their selection is that they've started offering a lot more heavily processed coffees. So that did limit the amount of coffees I was willing to try. And I settled on this Mexico mostly because it sounded like a pretty safe coffee and one that I was likely to enjoy a little bit more than some of the other things they were offering. So I'm looking forward to discussing this one, as this right here is day 27. And recipe we settled on for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee, in the past I've noticed that Hex roasts a little bit lighter than a lot of other American coffee roasters, and I was even surprised that this, being a Mexican coffee, was lighter than initially expected. Even then, it's not an overly light coffee, so I think the best description I have for this one is that it's on the lighter side of a light medium in terms of that roast profile. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 11, first impression, and I did start this one a little early. Ran it through the Chemex for the first time, and I noticed a lot of what you would expect from Mexican coffees, with some robust characteristics, most distinctly thinking of some nuttiness and some chocolate aspects right at the forefront. But it was dominated, interestingly enough, by a sweetness and complexity to balance those other components out, as it was slightly herbal, and for the most part, it left a pretty positive first impression, given that it was a fair bit sweeter than I initially expected going into it. Day 13, a much better second day, as the cup continued to have a lot more sweetness than initially expected. And this time it was run through the V60, and what I noticed most was the chocolate being an even more dominant aspect at the forefront. But it does have a nice sweeter spice to the cup as well, and that's something I'm going to highlight throughout the entirety of this review, was this kind of interesting sweet spice aspect to it, with a complementary dark fruit quality as well. It's been pretty interesting up to this point. We continue on to day 15 as we ran it through the April dripper for the first time, and it continues to remain above expectations, as there was more of that nice spice quality to the cup, with a dominant sweeter chocolate at this time. And going into it, given that they had a cacao note listed on here, I was fully expecting a more robust, darker, or even bitter chocolate. But it was interesting to see that this was a slightly more soft and milk chocolate-like aspect for me. So I really liked that part of this coffee. In addition to that, there was so much more I felt could be obtained from this coffee. It just felt like we were kind of scratching the surface at this point. So another pretty nice day. Day 17, the cup does continue to improve, as the best is likely ahead of it, with even more sweetness in the cup today. Much more of that sweet spice, once again, with the chocolate encompassing the majority of the cup. In general, a lot of darker aspects to it, including the fruit aspect. So something I probably expected going into it, it's just nicely countered by an abundance of sweetness. Day 19, back through the V60, and it was at this moment I opted for the Chemex, as I noticed I was just enjoying it slightly more through the Chemex, as there's a little bit more of the nutty aspect in this one, which isn't necessarily an overly dominant theme or something I noticed too much through the Chemex. In addition to that, it's still on the sweeter side of that chocolate, with a fair bit of that darker fruit and spice, but for the most part, it's slightly less vibrant in general. Day 21, little has changed to the cup, as it does continue to offer plenty of those sweeter chocolate aspects, with a bit of that sweeter spice in general, and the darker fruit. Pretty consistent coffee once I settled on this recipe, once I settled on this brew method, but not overly bright, just pretty clean all around, so I'm continuing to enjoy this coffee. Day 23, best day of the coffee to this point, as it was building upon the chocolate aspects from the past, as now it is in terms of the peak sweetness for that, as well as the sweet spice that is still quite complementary to that. There is a richness to the cup, with a strong darker fruit aspect yet again. I would say that was a little bit more tertiary for me. First thing was the chocolate that can be noticed right from the onset, and then that sweet spice was really kind of standing out to me in this cup, especially through the V60, especially through the Chemex. Day 25, another nice day of the coffee, as the darker fruits are the most prominent they've been. This is when I really started seeing a lot more of the listed plum, and I think they have dates listed on here. That's when I could say it was just maybe a little bit more defined, and as this coffee has continued to age, I'm starting to feel a little bit more of those. It's countering the chocolate and spice a little well. It continues to lean into those plum-like notes with the tea-like aspects highly noticeable in this cup. As one thing I found really interesting, haven't commented on yet, we'll discuss a little bit more in the tasting wheel, is that it remains light in terms of the body, as well as the kind of savory tea aspects to this cup. Something I haven't mentioned too much, but it was mostly because I was focusing on the things that were really kind of dominating this cup. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. And 4 level 4s. So let's go through those real quick, and we will start with the cleanliness level 4. Yes, once again, I don't think there's too much to say on that one. It is a wash processed Mexican coffee, and there are times where maybe wash processed Mexican coffees can be a little overdeveloped, or maybe they lack a specific sort of defined profile to it. This one didn't have any of those issues, so it's right there at that level 4 mark, and I'm quite happy with it being there. Finish, level 4. Yes, and once again, don't think that there's too much to say on that one. Has a pretty lingering kind of chocolate-like finish to the cup, which was quite nice. I think it gave the cup just a nice bit of balance in general. Sweetness, level 4. That's one of the first things I mentioned about this coffee when going into it, was that it was a lot sweeter than initially expected. That's really good for a Mexican coffee, and while it might not be as sweet as some other coffees in general, I still think it's on the lower side of the level 4, and reaching that level 4 to begin with is a really nice positive for me on this one. Chocolate, level 4. Yes, and right from the start I mentioned that that was the most noticeable things in this coffee, as this chocolate, again, a little bit more soft than initially expected. Typically when I see that cacao, I'm expecting a more robust chocolate, but this cup I would never say at any point was overly robust. If anything, it had those characteristics right at the start, but even then they were in a slightly more soft manner. Towards the end, I was really starting to see it soften up in general, and a lot of the aspects you were feeling in this one were never a very strong, heavy component within it. Then we have a handful of level 3s. We'll start with the spice, level 3. That was interesting to me. I'm not entirely sure which note might have gone in that direction. They have an oolong listed on here, and I could see that with the savory, because there is kind of that savory tea aspect to it, this kind of black tea aspect, in addition to it being kind of light-bodied. But the spice was a nice little added benefit, because it did feel really nice in this coffee, and it was one of the more unique standout things for me about this one when compared to a lot of Central American coffees in general. So that was a nice little added benefit for me. Saltiness, level 3. Yes, there was still a slight bit of that nutty aspect, and while it might be on the lower side of the level 3, I did still feel it slightly in the Chemex, and that's one of the main reasons I opted for it a little bit more through that brew method as opposed to the V60, was because there was a fair bit more of that nuttiness through the V60, which isn't necessarily my favorite flavor profile in coffee all around. Let's see here, berry fruit. We'll go to the stone fruit, level 3, and as I kind of mentioned towards the end of the notes, that became a much more pronounced component to this coffee, and that's of course going to be the listed plums. And I do have to say that if there's any fruit I was feeling for the entirety of this coffee, that felt pretty much on point with what I was experiencing, given that there wasn't a whole lot of fruit aspects within this one. Citrus and berry fruit both kind of at that level 2 mark, and they were very slight, not a whole lot of citric or berry fruit aspects to it. So most pronounced one was the stone fruit, and I still feel like maybe with a little bit more time you could bump that all the way up to a level 4 with a little bit more work. You could get a lot more of that kind of stronger, dark stone fruit aspect to it, but I'm happy with it there at that level 3 mark. And then the savoriness we have at the level 3 as well. I briefly mentioned that. That's the kind of tea-like aspect to this one. And then a couple of level 2s that I feel like are really worth noting, and that is the body at level 2. That's really surprising to me. This coffee, I fully expected, given it being a Mexican coffee, to have a fair bit more body in general, and given that it was so tea-like in terms of the body, even when run through the V60, it didn't necessarily have as much texture as I might have expected going into it. That was a very interesting and unique component for a Mexican coffee as well. And then the acidity level 2, this coffee isn't overly bright, which I'm not going to complain about. I don't mind if the acidity reaches that level 2 mark. It might be on the slightly higher side of the level 2, and given that this coffee is maybe on the slightly lighter side of a lot of American coffees, it's very interesting that that reached that level 2 mark, because I just think that kind of goes to show that this coffee was never necessarily meant to be an overly bright one. And once again, that's fine with me. I think that's kind of the only thing worth discussing on this tasting wheel that's left. So I think this is a pretty nice representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I like this one. This one continued to grow on me with more time. One thing that really stood out about it was, of course, the sweetness, which I kind of mentioned right at the start. It wasn't what I was necessarily expecting going into this. I was fully expecting this one to be a very standard Mexican coffee, and kind of looking at these notes, I didn't necessarily expect to like this one a whole lot, given that everything listed on here isn't the type of thing I go for in coffees in general, but this one felt safe, and I think because it was safe, it kind of exceeded those somewhat low expectations, but that just goes to show that I have enjoyed Hex's coffees in the past, and if I continue to try a lot more of their wash process coffees, I think that that might continue to be the case with them. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, there are a lot of directions I want to go with this one, and I think one of the first directions I want to go is maybe some less bright coffees in general, because it's not often these days that we actually have coffees that score lower than level 3 in terms of that brightness. So if you want something with maybe a little less acidity, maybe a little less brightness, but still with plenty of sweetness, then I think this is a good start in that direction. In addition to that, if you want something that offers a fair bit of chocolate, like this still offers a lot of traditional Central American characteristics in terms of the chocolate, the nuttiness, sweetness, chocolate, nuttiness, and spice aspects. This has it with a fair bit of fruit to kind of balance all of those things out while still maintaining a pretty clean profile in general. So that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Nuevo Paraiso Wash Process Mexico from Hex Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.